the Sicilian defense after e4, c5, the move 2 c3 is relatively a newcomer compared to moves like 2 f4 or 2 b4, the wing gambit, which were analyzed by Greco as early as 1620. The move 2 c3 first appeared in tournaments in London 1841, and we'll look at that game. A master, H.W. Popper, is playing white against the famous Howard Staunton. After 2 c3, Staunton, playing black, played e6. White now played knight f3, and after d5, e5. We get close to a version of the advanced French. Now today's master, of course, knows that d4 is probably the best way for black to obtain equality. However, in that day, after e5, knight to c6, d4, we did in fact arrive at a position from the advanced French. Staunton correctly attacks the base of the white pawn chain on d4 with his queen, and white plays the gambit variation with bishop to d3. Black plays bishop to d7. And again, with the benefit of hindsight, thanks to the work of Aaron Nimzowitsch in the 1920s, we know that the proper way is to play c takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop d7, which is more precise. Note here, of course, that knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen d4, bishop b5 check is a discovered attack on the black queen. Now going back to bishop d7, white now sees that his pawn on d4 is attacked multiple times. The correct course, of course, would be d takes c5, bishop c5, and castles with the plan of advancing with b4. This was demonstrated quite nicely in my system by Aaron Nimzowitsch, the classic game being Nimzowitsch white against George Sawi. Back to our game at hand in 1841, after bishop d7, white played bishop to c2. Black now played rook c8. And again, today's masters in this type of position know that you should play cd4, cd4, and knight b4, chase after this very powerful, dangerous white bishop. And if white tries to save the bishop with bishop to b3, then of course bishop to b5, working on the d3 square, is very strong. But again, keep in mind, this was London 1841, quite a long time ago. A lot of this theory had not been developed. So after rook c8, as played in the game, white now castled, and black played a5. White played a4, securing the b5 square, and black now played a positional weakness, g6. Today, of course, we know we do not want to be weakening the dark squares around our king side. White now got the correct idea with d takes c5, and after bishop takes c5, knight a3, routing the knight to the b5 square. Black, for his part, undermined the white center with f6, and after ef6, knight f6, knight to b5. Castles, we had a fairly normal looking position. White now inserted his bishop on h6, and black, according to Staunton himself, played a very premature counterattack with knight g4. This does attack the bishop, and attacks twice, and attacks 3 times on the f2 pawn. Note, instead of knight g4, had black continued with rook f7, knight g5 is a little better for white, or the attack bishop takes f2 check, rook takes f2, knight g4, looks very strong. It attacks the bishop, attacks the rook twice, but after queen d2, white simply connects everything and emerges with extra material. So going back to the game, after bishop h6, knight g4, white now accepted the exchange on f8, and after bishop f2 check, ducked his king in the corner, and on rook takes f8, played the very strong queen e2. This has a simple threat of h3, kicking the knight, followed by capturing on f2. After bishop c5, white followed with the powerful stroke, knight to d4. This attacks the knight on g4, the weak pawn on e6, and, probably most importantly, opens up the f-file. After rook f1, black still has problems to face. After e5, it appeared that he seemed to be doing okay. His knight is protected, his center pawns now seem mobile. However, queen to f3 reminded black how important the open f file is, and the weakness on d5 and f7 is felt very rapidly. After knight d8 covering f7, queen takes d5 check, bishop e6, knight takes e6, knight takes e6, and the winning pin with bishop to b3. Staunton, in fact, at this point resigned. After knight f2 check, you simply chop it off, rook takes, bishop takes, and even stronger than capturing on e6 is the powerful knight to d6, cutting off the black queen's communication, leaving the knight pinned, leaving the black king very exposed. So all in all, a fantastic success for the first time out with the 2 c3 Sicilian. The next example we see of the 2 c3 Sicilian actually, surprisingly enough, occurred 1 year later in Paris, 1842. John William Schulten, a master, is playing white against the very famous Pierre Charles Saint-Amant. Saint-Amant, of course, was one of the strongest players of the time, and after c3, he now played e5. This, in my view, is a slightly dubious, from a positional point of view, continuation. However, it was quite popular for a while, and touted by the Russian trainer Filippenko much later in the next century. Now with Saint-Amant, of course, he sees white wants to play d4, and he puts a second pawn to pressure the d4 and f4 squares. White, in keeping with the spirit of the time, played f4. Of course, today's modern master would follow Sveshnikov's recommendation of knight f3, simply attacking the pawn on e5, and when black does something about the pawn with knight c6, bishop to c4. This very solid positional continuation offers white very reasonable chances for an advantage. The bishop is beautifully posted on the c4 to f7 diagonal. We will see some examples of that later when we look at the theoretical games. Back to our game from Paris, 1842, white continued very much in the style of the day, a la King's Gambit, with f4. After d6, played knight f3, and after e takes f4, established his pawn duo in the center with d4. After knight f6, bishop d3, bishop e7, bishop to f4. At this point, we can clearly say the opening has been a success for white. He has the pawn duo and excellent development. But after castles, knight d2, knight c6, castles, bishop g4, faced with the slightest bit of pressure on his center, white now mishandles the position. He played e5. This is a terrible mistake and premature, and tactically flawed because the bishop on d3 is simply on pre. Today's modern master would play d5, gaining a serious space advantage, and after knight h5, for example, attacking the bishop on f4, simply retreat with bishop e3, and after knight e5, again another retreat with bishop d2 would leave white very well placed. The black pieces are going to have to do something to resolve the situation, and white's going to enjoy a space advantage. So again, after bishop to f4, we can say the opening was clearly a success for white, but coming back to this position after e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, a terrible mistake according to Saint-Amant, and we have to agree with him. He recommended bishop e5, but even then, after knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes on f6, black simply has one extra pawn and beautiful pair of bishops. Again, winning by today's standards. But going back to the game, after d takes e5, d takes e5, black now played knight h5. White has both of his bishops under attack, and after bishop h7 check, king takes, knight to g5 check, black continued accepting everything white offered, with bishop takes, queen takes, and knight takes f4. Clearly black has a winning material advantage. After knight e4, knight back to e6, queen h5 check, king g1, and again, very much in the spirit of the day, white threw everything that he could at black, but after queen e7, rook d7, queen takes, knight check, pawn takes, rook takes, and bishop takes, white now realized he was completely out of material, 2 rooks and 2 knights behind, and appropriately enough tossed in the towel. So, not a great outing for our second historical c3 Sicilian, although this defeat cannot be blamed on the opening. Clearly, the opening position reached after 7 bishop to f4 is excellent for white. In our next historical example, occurred quite a number of years later in Berlin, 1864. Playing black was the famous Adolf Anderssen, and playing white was the master Berthold Schul. After e4, c5, we now see the first example of the 2 knight f3 move order. And after e6, white now played c3, preparing to play d4 and establish the duo pawn center. After knight c6, d4, white did in fact establish the pawn duo on e4 and d4, and after d5, black has sort of a French defense setup. Sveshnikov considers that e5, playing the white side of the advanced French, is probably the best way for white to play for theoretical advantage. Sveshnikov was tremendously successful from this type of position and showed many fine examples of how to handle white's prospects. Back in Berlin, 1864, though, white played e takes d5, and after e takes d5, played bishop to e2. Bishop to b5 was Karpov's choice against Polgar in Linares 1994, a game that we will look at. That game was played, of course, 230 years later than our present game. Also, instead of bishop to e2, bishop to e3, pressuring the c5 pawn and trying to encourage clarification of the center, was a big favorite of Edward Rosenthalis, Soviet master who had a lot of success on the white side of the c3 Sicilian. I'm sure we will see many of his games much later. Back to Berlin, 1864, after bishop e2, knight f6, castles, c takes d4. Now, again, today's modern master probably would take with the knight and try to play against the weak pawn or isolated pawn on d5, if you will. But after c takes d4, keeping this symmetrical pawn structure, bishop e7, knight c3, castles, bishop e3, white does have a slight lead in development, but it's pretty negligible in terms of creating an advantage. After bishop d6, queen d2, bishop e6, knight g5, bishop f5, and now white goes on a bit of a fishing expedition with f4. He voluntarily weakens his square on e4. After rook e8, h3, rook c8, knight back to f3, we can see clearly from a positional point of view, after knight e4, bishop e4, black stands better. Has complete control of the e4 square. His rooks are placed on the open files. That notwithstanding, white managed to draw the game in 56 moves. A pretty unconvincing performance on the third game out for our c3 Sicilian, but historically significant because it did introduce the 2 knight f3 move order.